Welcome to Holistic Wellness from Within. Today, I'm going to speak with you about what the meaning of the NAK ratio is on a mineral analysis test, a hair mineral analysis test. And it is the most important ratio on your test. And I'm sure if many of you are working with me, you've gotten the shortened version of what this ratio means. But today, I'm going to go into more detail. So let's talk about the NAK ratio. Now, the NAK ratio is considered to be the vitality ratio, and it is the ratio that does equate to what's happening with the immune system. So we'll go over this in detail as I go through the meaning of a high and low NAK ratio. And that, of course, is the sodium to potassium ratio. Ideally, the sodium to potassium ratio should be at 2.50. Now, when that ratio is over 4, it is considered to be elevated or a high NAK ratio. And this is what I call the inflammatory pattern or your itises. All the itises many times occur when the body is in inflammation, and we see this when the NAK ratio again is elevated. So we can see things like arthritis, gastritis, tendonitis, any kind of itis with an elevated NAK ratio. Also, this pattern is an indicator many times of some negative emotions such as anger, hostility, or even a person who tends to be a little bit more aggressive. So that may be another reason that the NAK is elevated. Now, the kind of stress we're looking at with a NAK ratio that's elevated is acute. Acute stress, that is, because acute stress, the NAK ratio is regulated by the adrenal hormones, and aldosterone is elevated when there is an acute stress, and that does create an elevated NAK ratio. So oftentimes we'll see depleted depleted potassium with elevated sodium with a high NAK ratio, and that is occurring many times in the kidneys, the intestines, the sweat, and in the saliva. Now, the sodium retention, again, by having high aldosterone, and most of you know when you get your hair analysis back, if you have elevated, even just elevated sodium, maybe the NAK ratio isn't even high, but sodium's elevated, we know that comes from that high aldosterone. So the aldosterone and the cortisol are not being balanced in the body. So we definitely want to balance between those two hormones for the body to optimally function. So that's what we're looking at, an acute stress. That is more of a stress that is more intense or recently intense, not stress that's been around for as long of a time. It's more of an acute reaction to something that may be happening. And sometimes people do stay in a high NAK ratio for a long time. I tend to be a high elevated NAK client, but many and even most clients tend to fall on the low side. It doesn't matter where you fall in that NAK ratio. It is understanding it, what we can do about it, and supplementation for the NAK ratio is very important to either bringing that ratio up or down. But it is, again, when it's elevated, an early reaction or alarm reaction where the sodium remains low, but the potassium is elevated. Now, when you see an elevated NAK ratio in a slow oxidizer, this will often mean that this is a very exhaustive stage of stress. So that is something that even though one can have acute stress, it is a response that's showing us it is very exhaustive. A slow oxidizer with a low sodium to potassium ratio has a double exhaustion stage pattern, which is even less desirable, but we'll talk about the low NAK ratio in a moment. So we know that this is, again, an inflammatory pattern caused by high aldosterone, which is a pro-inflammatory hormone, and again, it's not being balanced with the right amount of cortisol or cortisone, and therefore it is creating that high NAK ratio, and we do need to balance the hormones for the body to work well. So we want to bring the aldosterone down and the cortisol levels up, and that would give us more balance and start to move the NAK ratio in the direction it does need to move. Now, the higher the NAK ratio, the more intense or the more inflammatory patterns a person may have. So again, those are your things like arthritis, bursitis, gastritis, any kind of itis, because itis, the ITIS, does mean inflammation. So any kind of inflammatory pattern. And we also know that inflammation is related to disease and illness. So, of course, we don't want to be in inflammatory patterns. Now, in regards to metal, what does it tell us when our NAK ratio is high? Well, it can mean that there is some hidden copper toxicity in the body, especially if you're a slow oxidizer. And this is because the copper will then push the sodium upward and it will depress or decrease the potassium reading. Now, the copper may not look present on your hair analysis, as many of you know, because the copper is what we call hidden, hiding out, or what I like to call the dirt under the rug. Just because it isn't elevated on your report doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that it, again, is hiding out in various organs and tissues in the body. And when these metals are hiding out, they can cause a problem with the NAK ratio. So as copper and cadmium and mercury and other toxic metals are eliminated on a retest, we'll often see that the NAK ratio improves. We just needed to get rid of those hidden metals that are deep inside the body and often doing quite a bit of harm wherever they're hiding. So we really want to get rid of them. Now, also keep in mind that there may be a temporary the NAK ratio may temporarily actually rise when something like cadmium is being eliminated. And that's because the kidneys have to process that cadmium and move it out. And it's a very stressful reaction to the body. It's a necessary one because, of course, we want that cadmium to move. But when it does, it can create a stress on the kidneys, and that would create a temporary high NAK ratio, but that will resolve itself. So, of course, when I'm doing your retest, I'm always going to give you the whole picture, what I see happening. So I'll be able to tell many times why something is moving. And then I'll explain to you, this is why this moved or didn't move. And so this is really true, especially also of zinc and magnesium. Now, with a high NAK, these minerals are many times deficient in the body. Now, zinc is always being pushed around by metals. It's being pushed up, it's being pushed down. It goes every which way as metals are moving. But with a high NAK ratio, zinc is the supplement that I use to counter or bring down the NAK ratio, reduce the inflammation, and get that zinc into the body. Now, I recommend the amount of zinc you need based on how high your ratio is, so you can keep that in mind. And so this is why it's never recommended just to take a lot of zinc without knowing what your mineral levels look like. Because, as I mentioned, most people are going to have low NAK ratios, and many times they will drive that NAK ratio really low by taking the supplement zinc. So keep that in mind as you are moving forward, because I will recommend exactly what you need. There'll be no guesswork. We'll be looking at what's happening in your body, retesting to make sure that if those changes occur, we address them. Now, of course, since we're talking about high sodium, I always get the question about salt intake. But proper sea salt, which is actually recommended and really good for the adrenals, is good for the body whether or not the sodium ratio is elevated for the most part. If you're eating good quality sea salt, it has very little to no effect on the elevation of the sodium levels in the body, because that sodium is actually needed and is a good form of sodium. Now, traditional table salt, on the other hand, that can create a lot of problems, and it can create high blood pressure, and it can certainly create elevated sodium levels. And of course, if you are eating a lot of processed foods, you're probably getting a lot of salt because it's just added to everything to add flavor. And of course, on your program, I don't recommend eating processed foods anyway, but that's just something to keep in mind. So anyway, again, this is typically a stress reaction. And that stress reaction is what causes the aldosterone to rise, the cortisol levels to drop, creating the imbalance, creating the high NAK, not so much to do with intake of sodium. Now, on the other hand, the low NAK ratio, which is more common. So you are probably, many of you are familiar with having an NAK ratio below 2.50. Now, when it falls below 2.50, we're looking at burnout. And you'll note when you're working with me, the amount of burnout you have, it is dependent on how low that number is. So that burnout number can go up if the number is lower. So we really want to, of course, bring the NAK ratio up to 2.50. Now, again, adrenal burnout is the cause, many times, that very exhaustive stage of stress that causes us to go into that adrenal burnout. And then that sodium level that's being controlled by the aldosterone completely changes, and the aldosterone becomes low in the body. And so that makes the NAK ratio end up becoming low. So we really want to think about that, because again, this is usually a person who is in more of an exhaustive stage of stress. Now, and please know, I am certainly, even though I'm going into more detail here, I'm still giving you very basic guidelines. We could go into this. I could talk about this for an hour. So I'm trying to just kind of pull it together, both of those high and low ratios, and summarize it for you. Now, when you have a low NAK ratio, we're usually looking at glucose intolerance. The body is not processing sugar very well, and it's not burning glucose very well, and that will contribute to greater fatigue, cravings for sweets, as well as sometimes those high sugary carbohydrates and blood sugar related symptoms. So if the body can't process glucose correctly, what does it do? Well, it tends to break down protein. So protein gets broken down in the body many times when the NAK ratio is low because of this reaction where the glucose isn't being processed correctly. And so there's excessive tissue breakdown, which can lead to many health conditions. So you could have maybe a breakdown that occurs in the joints, where you again would have arthritis. Even though arthritis can be related to a high NAK, it certainly can occur in that exhaustive stage of stress with a low NAK as well. And of course, if tissue is breaking down in other areas of the body, you would have aches and pains in other places. So there is a protein being metabolized here that we need to stop that process, get the glucose to work correctly, and that way the body will then the NAK ratio, as it corrects itself, you'll feel much better. With a low NAK, there's often a real feeling of frustration because a person is extremely tired. They feel resentful. They even feel angry or hostile because they feel like they're just in a ditch and they can't get out, or beating their head against the wall because they just feel like they're not getting any better. They're often living in a very, or they've been living for a long time in that fight phase of life, or in sympathetic dominance, as we say. And so they're just trying really hard to survive. And that's a constant trying, but feeling like you're not succeeding will many times create frustration. And this, of course, is due to, again, the opposite of what the high NAK ratio is, which was acute stress. This is more chronic stress. And chronic stress usually means that it doesn't matter if it's coming internally or externally from an outside source, but it usually has been going on for some time. So it's wearing the body down, and the body's not overcoming from stress. Where acute stress is often something that happens, you have a reaction to it but then you overcome that stress, and so the body repairs a little better. Well, with chronic stress, there is a breakdown of tissue, and many times then some of your chronic illnesses begin to occur. So we do see potassium loss on a cellular level with a low NAK ratio. So we definitely want to make sure that the potassium is being used well in the body. But let me just mention that supplementing with potassium does not help. Whenever somebody has that real low potassium, and trust me, I've had clients try this before, and it does not work. So please don't waste your money. When you're taking a potassium supplement, it many times is just a very toxic form that's not absorbed by the body, and it ends up being urinated out of the body because we are looking again at a stress reaction. The stress is what's lowering the NAK ratio, and so putting potassium in the body isn't going to correct that, and the potassium that you put in will simply be removed through the kidneys, and so that's not really going to repair the NAK ratio much. Now, the Limcomin supplement that we recommend does help bring the NAK ratio up. So, of course, whether you have a high or low NAK ratio, taking the right supplements for that ratio is extremely important. And then also managing stress, because stress is, whether it's acute or whether it is chronic, it will have an effect on the NAK ratio. So we want to really balance and learn to manage stress so we can bring those hormones into balance and bring the NAK ratio into balance, where we will then really get rid of a lot of really illnesses or prevent them from happening. So I like to call, and I do this whenever I talk about the NAK ratio on a report, I like to call it your immune ratio, the immune system ratio, because when it is high, there's more inflammation, there's more itises, and when it is low, there are more a propensity for more illnesses to be present. And this can include very serious illnesses, which I'm sure you've seen and maybe even been alarmed to see that it might mention that you have a low NAK ratio, and therefore you could have chronic diseases or serious diseases like cancer and diabetes and kidney issues. These are very rare. Most of my clients don't come into the program with this, and certainly if we address it, they're not going to, end up with these issues. If we're addressing the NAK ratio, we can many times prevent a lot of those serious issues from occurring. So that's what we want to do. So you also, with the low NAK ratio, may find that you're more apt to catch colds or viruses or, just those little daily things that you go through. Those are present, and your body's more susceptible to that easily when the NAK ratio is low, because the immune system is not functioning well. And if it's not functioning well, if it's under functioning, so to speak, we're more apt to be ill. Where when the immune system is overactive, which is where it is when the NAK ratio is high, especially if it's extremely high, then we have more autoimmune diseases and issues. So we, of course, want neither one of those, but we want to bring the NAK ratio into a balanced state to, again, bring about improved health. So keep this in mind. Please go through and read through the information I have sent over on your handout about the NAK ratio. It's also going to be posted on my website. So you can either go to in the newsletter. Well, actually, if you click on the handout in the newsletter, it will take you to where I have posted this information on the blog on my site, so you can read about that information there as well. Now, what I would ask you to do is just please feel free to post this video, share it with friends, ask people and tell them about the mineral balancing program and how it works. And if they're interested in learning more about why we use the mineral balancing program or what these ratios means, these videos will be very helpful to share with your friends and family. So I do ask that you share this on any media platform that you can. And I do also want to tell you that you can purchase your hair mineral analysis at holisticlifestyleconsulting.com. I'm Holistic Wellness from Within. My contact information is also there, so you can also contact me if you have questions or you want more information. And also keep in mind that if you do need to retest on time. The NAK ratio is a ratio that often flips very easily. And so if you're taking that supplement that you've been taking for 3 or 4 months and then you don't retest, then it may be time to change. And maybe not. Maybe you still need zinc. Maybe you still need limcomin. But we don't know until we look. So that is the reason we use the mineral balancing program and the hair mineral balancing test to see what's going on at the cellular level, which is so much more important than what's really happening in the blood. And that's a topic for another video. But please contact me if you have anything you would like me to speak about, any topic you would like me to discuss. Please leave that information for me as well on my contact form or email me with it. And again, I hope you'll visit my website, holisticlifestyleconsulting.com. And if you have any questions or you need anything whatsoever, always contact me and I'm always here to help. Thank you so much for listening to this video from Holistic Wellness from Within.